We're approaching the end of Irreversible Damage, so the time has come for the, as Shrier puts it, canary in the coal mine for these youths who are assigned female at birth. Individuals who, for whatever reason, have detransitioned. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi, welcome back to the channel, and enjoy this moment of positivity because, to be blunt, there's not going to be a lot of it in this video. There will be the credits kitties of some form, and if we're lucky, cute kitties throughout, but yeah, this is going to be a rough one. And to spoil things a smidge, if I go with the title I have planned, I am 100% guilty of doing the thing where if a question is asked in the headline, the answer is no. Before kicking things off, quick refresher for the visual shorthand indicating where ideas are coming from. This means I'm paraphrasing the book. This means I'm responding to the book or integrating my thoughts with science. And we are bringing the science to this discussion because 8 of the 11 references for this chapter are to the gender-critical blog Fourth Wave Now. Make of that what you will. By the way, do you like my sweater? I like my sweater. You want my sweater? I have merch. I have shirt merch now. Link will be in the description box, and you can check out sweaters, which are so soft. I'm not upselling this. Like, this is the softest sweater I've owned in a long time. Fun little notebooky guys. Mugs, stickers, and stuff. Every purchase will also get you a personalized thank you from me. And yeah, I think I'm gonna ditch this though. And yeah, here we go. There's one thing I want to say and make clear here at the outset. In talking about detransition, I do not want to invalidate anybody. I may have some questions about particular details for the people's stories that Shrier shares, but that does not mean I am questioning these people's identities or what they've been through. One of the points of what Shrier refers to as gender ideology is that we believe people on their gender. If somebody says they're trans, cool. If somebody who used to identify as trans says they're not, also cool. But a caveat to add here is the existence of some AFAB people who have detransitioned does not mean that all AFAB trans or non-binary people would follow the same path if, according to this chapter, they hadn't been brainwashed, but more on that in a few. I'm saying this clearly because part of Shrier's argument in this chapter is that the larger trans and or non-binary community plus allies deny the existence of people who have detransitioned, which, no. Of the larger trans and or non-binary YouTubers I'm aware of, all of them have at least acknowledged the existence of people who have detransitioned, at least in passing, and several of them have videos discussing detransition and not from an invalidating perspective. As we'll get to, I think some of the muddiness here comes from who gets the most promotion. Benji, Helena, and possibly others included in this chapter are not only people who have detransitioned, they have also joined up with the gender-critical crowd. And to be frank, the gender-critical crowd is happy to signal boost them in their stories of how much a mistake it was for them to transition because it serves their narrative. Now don't get me wrong, I am currently in the process of gathering stories from people who are happy in their identity and or the transition steps they've taken for a kind of similar reason. And by the way, the email is still open for that, so if you're interested in submitting a story and you're a trans or non-binary, check out my social tab for info there. We're both talking about people and their lived experiences. Neither Shrier or I are currently trans or non-binary or have ever identified as such, so we're seeking out stories from people with that experience. The difference lies in what we're doing with those stories and what we ultimately think harm reduction entails. I think that the reported regret rate, especially for people who come to feel that transition was not the right thing for them, is low enough that we end up doing more harm by restricting access. Shrier's position seems to be that these people, in particular AFAB youth, will come to regret their transition and as such should be prevented from doing so for their own good. Also continuing the trend of Shrier's pronoun usage from the rest of this book, she uses the pronouns assigned at birth. Now, this makes total sense for people who have clearly identified themselves as cisgender, but there's one person who pops up briefly, largely without context, has a masculine sounding name, and has a quote that really serves to only make things more ambiguous. Given Shrier's track record of not really respecting people's pronouns, not sure exactly how to refer to Desmond. After consulting with the LGBTQ channel on my Discord, Desmond's going to get they/them pronouns when they show up. This chapter is centered on women's stories of detransitioning. The first focus is Benji, who is new to this book, and the second is Helena, who has showed up before. Eventually, Shrier includes a Fourth Wave Now post by Benji through which it is possible to find her online footprint. But in the interest of fairness, I'm not going to overtly include their YouTube channel in this video. I didn't want to point the internet at small trans and or non-binary creators like Shrier did in the Influencers chapter, so I'm not going to do that to somebody who's detransitioned, even if they wrote a piece for Fourth Wave Now. When Shrier spoke to her, Benji was in her 20s and a lesbian, but she identified as a man in her teens.
Benji is one of a growing number of young women uniquely capable of warning AFAB youth in the grips of gender fever that it might be a good idea to turn back. But Benji doesn't believe she merely avoided personal calamity. What she escaped, she insists, was a cult.
Before we get to the cult claim, and we are going to get to that thoroughly, trust, I want to draw attention to what Shrier's doing here. This cult idea is going to be an undercurrent in this chapter. While it hasn't been an overt focus until this chapter, there were a few asides laying the groundwork earlier in the book. But note that each time this idea is coming from someone else, never Shrier directly. And this may be a subtle distinction, but to me it seems like a way to integrate this idea, which is potentially thoroughly damning and scary, without overtly saying herself that these people are falling into a cult. When I'm covered in white hair later, you know why. It also seems like a choice not to bring in some sort of cult expert here. She's been more than happy to talk to experts when they are supportive of rapid onset gender dysphoria, psychologists to endocrinologists, but not an expert in psych here. Strange. Speaking of, let's talk cults. We're going to talk a little on the how of cults before we get to the YouTube favorite bite model. Starting with the first of the 4 persuasive factors that pull people into cults, chief communicator is the charismatic leader at the top. Leaders are generally perceived to have some form of credibility and expertise by their followers. Lower down the power structure, cult members themselves may also recruit, especially people they know and are trusted by. The message is typically of community and belonging, possibly of gaining access to some greater truth they've been searching for. This can be particularly appealing to people feeling alone or depressed. This message can be conveyed in person or in various forms online. The target audience is generally young and in the formative years of their lives, particularly if they're facing uncertainty or hardship. One of the facets of human behavior that cults take advantage of is the ability for actions to influence attitudes. When a new member joins up, they're made pretty active within the group. These can be internal activities tied to the group's beliefs, or external activities like tasks that require interfacing with non-members, all of which serve to solidify this person's membership in the group. The influence of actions to attitudes is generally a slow process, where small concessions gradually build into larger and larger ones. Cults also gradually trim down members' social worlds until they're only left with other members of the cult, which reduces the person's ability to get outside perspectives and discourages counter-arguments or dissent. Things can get a little tricky because some of these features can show up in arguably good things, like legitimate rehab programs. Part of the point of going to rehab is to essentially be persuaded out of using the substance, as well as removing the person from the physical and social environment they were in. The therapist or other staff likely has some rapport with the patients. Some can be downright charming. A person may enter treatment under the suggestion or insistence of someone they trust. In the course of treatment, the person will hopefully find ways to cope with life that don't involve the substance, which somewhat mirrors the life lessons people may be trying to find in cults. Someone entering treatment is probably not at a great point in their lives. If they were, it would be much more difficult to convince them to go into rehab. This hopefully helps to illustrate the difficulty that can exist when trying to differentiate between culty cults and close-knit groups. The bite model is the handiwork of Steve Hassan, who is one of the world's top experts on cults. Some of his expertise comes from first-hand experience with the Unification Church, a group that seems to have a lot of input on their Wikipedia page. The bite model is a way to quantify the amount of influence a person or group has over someone. As pointed out by Hassan, some amount of influence isn't necessarily a bad thing. You could sign up for a program to help you quit smoking that would use some of the factors listed in the model. Things stop being benign when, quote, it undermines a person's ability to think and act independently. And yes, dear viewer, we are going to go through the bite model for transgender non-binary AFAB youth, the gender ideology, any of these possibilities that Shrier's thrown around. In part because the more I've thought about it and flipped back through things, the more it seems like this is the argument at the heart of this book. That there is a trans cult brainwashing these youths to further the trans agenda or something. I'm not entirely clear what the end goal would be in Shrier's mind, but it definitely is borrowing the language there. There are so many breadcrumbs sprinkled throughout this book, basically leading to this conclusion that I think it needs to be directly and explicitly addressed. And while we're here talking about this stuff, I may point out instances where it seems like it better describes the gender-critical crowd. If it comes up, you know. Before we really get started with this, one point of acknowledgement, caveat, something, is that I seem to be working with a different interpretation of reality than Shrier, Littman, and others of that same mind. If someone tells me they're trans and or non-binary, I don't question them on it, even if they're young. But this believing and listening to people can impact how certain behaviors or statements are viewed. As an example, in one of the parental stories Shrier shared, the kid said they were trans, flat out. But that youth is treated in the book like their wanting to transition came out of nowhere, despite evidence seeming to be pretty apparent from what was shared. A lot of this is going to come down to if Shrier's premise is correct, that ROGD is a thing that's happening in these youth. Hopefully, at this point in the series, I've made the case that it's not. The bite model captures 4 avenues of control that can be used on people: behavioral, informational, thought, and emotional. Because this is quite the extensive list, we're going to focus on the items that seem potentially relevant to what Shrier would argue. Also, for simplicity, I'm going to refer to a trans ideology despite there not really being one, other than trans and or non-binary people exist and are valid. This is in part because there isn't a defined leader or power structure like there is in actual cults. Quoting from Hassan's recently published dissertation on this model, the ultimate goal of behavior control is dependency on and obedience to the group, its ideology, and its leadership. All major life decisions must be approved or else dictated by the group. A member who does not get permission first for major decisions faces punishment. Individualism is discouraged, and putting God or the group first is mandatory. Rigid rules and regulations are mandated and enforced. Thoughts, feelings, and activities of self or others must be reported to superiors. I could see a gender-critical person making the case that the trans ideology is trying to regulate a person's physical reality by convincing them they aren't cisgender, but I don't think this is the case. But really, it seems like the stronger case would be for the gender-critical parents trying to regulate their trans and or non-binary kids' physical reality. It seems like at various points in this book, Shrier's argued that these youths are being implicitly told that they need to cut down their social circle to other trans and or non-binary people or allies, but that would be a misinterpretation of more general advice to minimize contact with people who aren't willing to treat them with basic respect. Also, unlike cults, these youths aren't being told where to live, who they get to see, and when. Although, parents cutting their kids off of their online support networks has been mentioned. Because of the disappearing lesbians argument, as well as the general tendency in gender-critical circles to neglect the existence of same-gender attraction in trans and or non-binary people, point 3 seems like something that could come up. But no. My impression is the trans ideology is generally pretty sex-positive. Consensually boink who you will. Shrier's emphasized these youths adopting the dress and hairstyle generally thought of as masculine, or at the very least androgynous. But I don't think this is coming from the trans ideology so much as dressing and styling themselves in a way that feels authentic. So it's not the group dictating these, it's broader cultural norms. Finances have come up in this book, but usually in the context of parents threatening or actually cutting off their children, so Shrier's emphasis on how much time these youths are spending on social media might fit into this leisure and entertainment category, but again, even if it does, it's not the group dictating that the youth spend their time this way. I'll mention now that one of the people Shrier talks about briefly in this chapter was sent to a labor farm for a year to help her reconnect with her body. Related to that, point 9 is basically one of the features of Shrier's argument, that these youths are self-indoctrinating themselves with transness. Whether you believe this is happening or not probably lines up with how gender critical you are. Shrier's played up the positive reinforcement someone would receive for coming out as trans, and it'll happen again in this chapter even. The negativity that can exist in the online space will also be brought up. These things do happen. The issue is if these youth are basically being classically conditioned to be trans. I would say, as an experimental psychologist, these sorts of interactions does not a Pavlovian trans make. Shrier's absolutely tried to argue that these kids' individuality has been suppressed along with a hive mindset. However, if you take more than a passing glance at the trans and or non-binary space, the variety of people's gender identities and expressions should discount this argument. And if accepting a person's gender identity is groupthink, I don't even know how to finish this sentence. Just no. There seems to be a gender-critical assumption that there are rigid rules and regulations in how someone is trans, like the whole buying into cultural stereotypes of what being a man is, but that seems like a stretch. To steelman this argument a bit, cancel culture is brought up in this chapter too, and yes, it does happen, and the chronically online should relax a bit. But this seems like a general hypervigilant social policing issue, not forcing members to adhere to the group's belief system. I could see Shrier's repeated emphasis on the suicide statistics falling into 15, but the suicide rate isn't being used by the trans and or non-binary community to keep the youth in line, which would be in keeping with the point of this item. Skipping to 18, it seems like some of the subtext in this book is that these youths are being shaped into a person who is dependent on and obedient to the trans agenda, which, no. Dropping down to 23, this is one of the threatened outcomes of transition included in this book. But if you look at the stories Shrier has shared, it wasn't the trans and or non-binary person or community that separated the family, although arguably this one is a matter of perspective. Okay, so for this category, the sometimes negative social space and cancel culture could potentially be argued as methods of behavioral control by the larger trans and our non-binary community. If we're being conservative, that leads to 2 out of the 25 fitting. On to information control. Analyzing information is vital to understanding undue influence. For example, an ethical group will inform newcomers about who they are, what they believe, and what is expected of them if they become a member. An unethical group uses deception by outright lying, withholding vital information, or distorting information to make it appear more acceptable. Often, all 3 types of lying are used and undermine the legal right of citizens to have informed consent to make decisions in their best interest. Hassan describes a typical structure of cults as very hierarchical, with important information coming from top leadership and strict guidelines for what gets shared publicly. For this, Shrier has tried to make the case that deception is in play, that the real outcomes from transitioning in some capacity aren't shared to be able to trans more youths. This falls apart real quick. The same videos that Shrier will point to as glorifying certain treatments or procedures will almost always include a discussion of the negatives or bad side effects experienced. The trans and or non-binary people I've listened to do not sugarcoat things. There's also the issue that there isn't some trans regulatory body that controls the information disseminated inside and outside the trans and or non-binary community. To be thorough, point 2 could have been made in this book. Maybe. If you take Shrier's description of the rabbit holing youth do when they find the online community as occurring at the cost of non-community information. This could also fit Shrier's talk about these youth being locked into an echo chamber that discourages dissenting opinions. But even if, emphasis on if, the strong version of these echo chambers exist, I still don't think it matches the total control that happens with cults. The trans ideology, such as it is identical for people who are trans and are non-binary and people who aren't. There isn't an operating trans level where you get increased access to the secrets of gender with the more cisness you purge from your system. For item 4 to work, leadership would need to be defined as the entirety of the trans and or non-binary community on the social media platforms. Like I said, there is a small subset of terminally online trans or non-binary people, there's no denying that, but they are not driving the ship. Shrier had a whole chapter on the influencers. So probably fair to say she considered the videos, blogs, and whatever the heck you youngins called Tumblr posts propaganda. Totally fair, in fact, because she says as much in the schools chapter. The upside of having to have bought this book is a digital thing. Control F-ing my way to relevant keywords. Huge time saver. Quoting a song again for context, mind-controlled cults, especially political cults, rely on the extensive use of propaganda. Internet websites and public and private videos are available 24/7, and meetings are often live-streamed. Bigger groups have publication departments that turn out newsletters, magazines, journals, audio tapes, videotapes, podcasts, blogs, apps, and other media. Famous people are quoted, often without their permission and totally out of context, but in a way that supports the credibility of the group. It seems like the critical piece here would be some cohesive, organized group generating this content, which there just isn't. I don't think this final item has been a point in this book. The closest to memory manipulation Shrier goes is when she describes coaching people may receive on how to talk about their experiences with a doctor. That said, Shrier's use of how people used to dress or act, and emphasis in how not trans they seem to be to their parents prior to discovering the concept or online space, seems like it's trying to use previous information against the person. If we're being unkind, it can sometimes feel like an attempt at manipulating the youth's memory on their childhood experiences. These items don't seem to track with how the trans and or non-binary community as a whole functions. Thought control seems to be where many of Shrier's arguments are set. The case has been made in Irreversible Damage that these youth need to buy into the trans ideology, and in some of the parental stories, the trans versus cis meme was mentioned. But this is another point where your lens will determine your perception. For comparison, is accepting a person's sexual orientation mean that you're adopting the gay community's map of reality? Is the cultural difference joked about with the "Are the straights okay?" videos indicative of black and white, morally loaded thinking? Item 2. Well, when changing the person's name and identity is recommended medical practice, is it still cult-like in that context? Obviously, hopefully, there is a difference between instances like Heaven's Gate and trans youth. The context in which the person takes the new name matters. I could see many terms in the trans community being called loaded language, like binders, packers, and so on. But the thing is, a community is going to develop its own jargon. We're lazy. We shorthand communication a bit. Also, the trans and or non-binary jargon doesn't really stop critical thought about the thing. We're going to try to not double dip, and we've covered social policing already, especially as that doesn't quite fit here. One person's rallying slogans are another's thought stoppers, I suppose. Trans women are women comes to mind. More broadly, if this one were to be applied by Shrier, it doesn't fit. People praying to their deity to fix them or their body to stop feeling awful because they're trans and or non-binary doesn't count here. Item 8 is a recurring argument of Shrier's, that these youths and the trans and or non-binary community at large have rejected rational analysis, critical thinking, and constructive criticism. The thing is the rational analysis and critical thinking is on the side of the trans and or non-binary people. Forbidding questions about the leader, doctrine, or policy would require a leader, actual doctrine that isn't something Shrier pulled together, and policy by the group. There are standards of care or other professional guidelines, but those aren't the community's. I suppose Shrier could make the case the trans and or non-binary community has labeled gender criticality as a super negative belief system, but it is, though? It's doing actual harm to people. Finally, while this item overlaps with the first in this category, Shrier seems to think that these youth have adopted this new trans map of reality. But for the trans and or non-binary people I've heard, it isn't really an alternate map of reality. It's an authentic one that they had to discover due to the cis-normative culture we live in. It's not a competing version of reality, it's an alternate mode of being within it. Altogether, there may be some things that superficially seem like they'd be a match, but with a little thought, they can be ruled out. Emotional control is the final category, and we're going to mix things up a little and focus more on Hassan's description than the itemized list. People are often initially love-bombed, flattered, and made to feel special. However, cult love is conditional upon being a good cult member and is quickly withdrawn if the person makes trouble by asking problematic questions. Members are required to always be grateful and happy as they are part of the chosen people who know the truth. They believe they have the key to the world's salvation in one way or another. Members often sing songs written about the leader or the doctrine or the group to keep positive. Listening to music, and especially singing cult songs to oneself as well as in the community, helps to access positive emotional states. Shrier will try and make the case that this type of emotional manipulation happened with Benji. It seems like the nature of Benji's pivot into the gender-critical space is downplayed, or at least how hurtful the rhetoric she started sharing is. Blame is kept focused on the trans and or non-binary community. Manipulative or abusive relationships are far too common, so you may have first or second-hand experience with this. Love bombing is a phase in an abusive relationship cycle where things are good. This is what keeps the target person invested in the relationship. The abuser or abusers are on their best behavior, trying to make the person feel so good, and they try to portray that this is the real state of the relationship. Over time, the cracks start to show and reality starts to bleed back in. As Hassan indicates, this may be because the person is asking too many questions or not playing the role they're supposed to well enough. While there are some people in the trans and or non-binary community who are manipulative or abusive, it doesn't mean the entire community is. A person who comes out as trans on Instagram may get a wave of positive responses from people, and those people will likely not continue to flood the person's posts after that. It's part of how social media works. The big posts that could use the most love and support, and probably uses hashtags that tend to get that response, will probably get more engagement than other posts. And if a person stops identifying as trans and or non-binary, the audience who is supportive may lose interest and stop engaging. But there is a difference between that and coming out swinging with gender-critical talking points than being surprised at the response. As you'll see when we get towards the end of Benji's story, that distinction is not made by Shrier. Members learn techniques like thought stopping and emotion stopping, mainly to block feelings of homesickness, anger towards leadership, or doubt. Whenever a person feels depressed or anxious or fearful, they are encouraged to feel guilty and engage in practices to further surrender themselves to the great leader or group. Whenever there is a problem, the group and leader are always right, and it is the member's fault. If members feel healthy emotions, like sexual attraction to someone who is not approved, they are told they are evil and sinful or tempting Satan. Likewise, jealousy, greed, and envy are labeled as negative, so members deny and suppress them. Shrier would probably argue for doubt out of these. Doubt that the person is actually trans and or non-binary. From what I've seen, on YouTube at least, doubt isn't something people are told to shy away from. It's a feeling you should listen to and feel out. Why are you feeling doubt? Is it because you aren't feeling right after having gone through the transition steps you have? Is it because you're concerned about other people's responses to you? Is it because you have gotten a negative response to the steps you've taken? Bringing this back to the actual topic of this video, some of the people who have detransitioned, however briefly, were probably at least partially inspired by doubt. Very understandable for the 0.4% who realized that gender transition wasn't for them. I could also see how pressure from family or other loved ones would cause one to doubt things. At the end of the day, you know you best. Do the best you can for yourself. If that means walking back your transition, do it. You are no less worthy of love or respect. The rest of this is more of a stretch, despite Shrier's claims to the contrary. This may be overextending Shrier's case, but she might consider the trans and or non-binary community as holding a person's potential as a trans and or non-binary person over their head. Not sure. Maybe there's also something baked in with the idea that the person's family, if not supportive, is deficient. I am admittedly speculating a bit here though. Shrier has tried to paint the picture that these youth are fed the idea that the world is hostile to trans and or non-binary people, which it is, or at least it can be. Finally, Shrier has tried to portray the trans agenda as indicating that identifying as trans and or non-binary is the only way for these youths to be happy, that they will end their lives if they can't transition. Those who stop identifying as such weren't really trans to begin with. But if you are trans and or non-binary, living a cis life would make it much more difficult to be happy. And the harsh reality is many people end their lives because of a lack of support or access to care. Lastly, if someone stops identifying as trans and or non-binary, okay, maybe they were trying on an identity that seemed like it might fit, but it ended up not. Or the external pressures were too much, but they'd like to try again at some point later, or maybe not. Aside from the external pressures part needing to fuck right off, what's the problem? As with the other control forms, these items don't really seem to fit. Individual members of the trans and or non-binary community may be engaging in emotionally manipulative or controlling behaviors, but the community on the whole is not. To wrap up this part, the trans ideology, identifying as trans and or non-binary, the trans and or non-binary community, none of these really fit the cult descriptors. For somebody who is against others identifying as trans and or non-binary and trying to live their authentic best life, The different features can be twisted to make it seem like they're joining up with a cult, but it just isn't. I wasn't sure where to put this comment, so hopefully here works. My intent in launching into that side discussion on cults was not to downplay or minimize the experiences of people who have detransitioned. We are going to spend the rest of this video and the next one talking about that. I just wanted to address that cult claim where it came up. With that said, where were we? Shrier provides many details for Benji's childhood and adolescence, but it's at a level where I feel like more questions are raised than Shrier wants to give answers for. You'll see what I mean. Benji is described as highly smart and anxious. She started developing secondary sexual characteristics at 9, which she was not thrilled about. That's roughly the age I did as well. I came into my adult form when I was 11 or 12. I was mostly annoyed and inconvenienced more than anything, but with where Benji's story is going, I can see how that would have made her uncomfortable. She developed an eating disorder and depression, which her parents were not apparently equipped to deal with. No shade intended here. Knowing how to handle psych disorders in your offspring is hard. In retrospect, I was probably a bit more than just kinda disordered in my eating from middle to high school. No breakfast, would have a candy bar and a Coke for lunch, and then whatever we were having for dinner. For a bit, my mom got me Carnation Instant Breakfast to try to get me to have something before school, but no. Gotta try to be skinny. And because I wasn't really passing out in class or underweight, we never talked about it and it went unnoticed. Then we get to the first part that opens up questions. Her parents had a rocky marriage. Her and her sibling were physically abused, and her sister coped with negative strategies. Not that any answer to these questions is going to be good, but what sort of physical abuse are we talking about here, and by who? From the context, it would sound like her parents, but potentially it could have been anyone. Also, I'm not clear on if this is being presented chronologically or not. Presumably, her parents' relationship was unstable throughout, but it's also possible to read this as it's starting after she was already having trouble. I'm also not sure about how old her sister is. If she's roughly the same age as Benji, smoking weed in middle school is a huge warning flag, more so if she was younger. This seems to imply a lot about how bad things were at home for them.
Benji fell into YouTube and Tumblr. At 13, she discovered videos of AFAB people enthusing over their transformation into men. Feeling unfeminine, awkward in her body, and unhappy at home, Benji found the possibility of escape enrapturing. She never doubted the accuracy of the purely positive accounts of medical transition.
Shrier's not even trying to pretend like she's respecting trans people at this point, although she hasn't really for a couple chapters now. Why change it up? So the 1-2 punch of time having lost all meaning at this point and me being in grad school in 2010 means I really don't have a good idea of what YouTube or Tumblr were like at that point in time. Quick search and BuzzFeed has informed me that Twilight and hipster typewriters and mustaches were popular then. Because I'm ignorant on this topic, and we have Benji's side of things, maybe you all could enlighten the rest of the class. Were trans and or non-binary videos really just pro-surgery, treatment, everything without really talking about the cons, or were there pros and cons even back then? But the thing about that potential detail is, at this point, given the attention Rowling has brought to this if nothing else, I find it harder to believe that a youth with some interest in the trans and or non-binary space wouldn't be aware of the potential negative outcomes. Feeling unfeminine can be part of the woman experience, but it can also be part of the AFAB trans and or non-binary experience, or trans woman experience. Lots of people can feel unfeminine with varying degrees of unhappiness with that feeling. And this will be more apparent as we continue, but it seems like Shrier is sort of downplaying this unhappy at home point. Lots of teens experience some sort of friction with their parents, but for most of them, social workers don't get involved. Benji told Shrier kids her generation may take online content at face value.
Postmodern queer theory regards experience as more valid than fact, she said, and her generation imbibes endless streams of this ideology from the internet. So when you see somebody on Tumblr talking about their experience and their opinions, that can trump data and facts because experience is more authentic than data or something.
Shrier is fully using Benji as a shield here, which is a little ironic given the context.
These trans and or non-binary youths are treating experience as more true than the data. But I don't need a citation for any of this because I'm talking to someone about their experience with this. And all those parents I've talked to, surely their experience is more important than the data about the importance of supporting gender nonconforming youth.
I almost want to applaud the audacity of using a quote for this. It almost seems like satire. Also, I'm not entirely clear about what data or facts Benji, or Shrier, is talking about here. Let's just reiterate that the data is on the side of supporting youth and their gender.
Benji decided privately that her story matched the video accounts of trans men online. She was trans too. She set up her first Tumblr account and quietly announced herself as trans to viewers. She wasn't sure anyone would notice. To her surprise, she received an overwhelming love bombing from strangers. You get people direct messaging you that you've never spoken to before, being like, "Wow, this must be so hard for you, how can I help you?" Or like, "You're so brave," like that kind of thing, she told me. There's just so much positive reinforcement that there's just no room at all for any criticism or any thought that something bad could be happening.
Wasn't part of Shrier's earlier argument that these youths are doing it because their friends are? Love bombing, positive reinforcement, no critical thought. They're really going for this cult angle, aren't they? Love bombing, in a cult perspective, is the coordinated effort, usually under the direction of leadership, that involves long-term members flooding recruits and newer members with flattery, verbal seduction, affectionate but usually non-sexual touching, and lots of attention to their every remark. Love bombing, or the offer of instant companionship, is a deceptive ploy accounting for many successful recruitment drives. Shrier, by way of Benji, keep throwing in these terms, possibly in an attempt to give the cult claim legitimacy, without real concern for how well the term fits. There isn't top trans brass making action plans to trans the youth. That a marginalized group is supportive to new members of the community is being used against it. And there isn't really a delicate way to say this, but Benji's home life was not good. She may have been very desperate for positive interactions, and so these DMs from people may have meant loads to her. She hasn't posted to her surviving social media accounts in roughly a year. So things may have changed offline, but as far as I can tell, she is still living as a cis lesbian, so trans was a bad fit. Fair enough. Maybe the positive interactions she was having with the trans Tumblr community were reducing her ability to ascertain the goodness of the fit, especially given her home life. That doesn't then mean that all trans and or non-binary AFAB youth are going through the same thing. We keep revisiting the detransition rate, but I think it's important to emphasize this doesn't seem to be something people do on a whim or because they're desperate for positive attention. Finally, transition is only a bad thing if you aren't trans and or non-binary. It's actually a good thing for people who are. Benji considered her online friends, who she described as being adults, her truest friends, and she was trans openly in that space. She then basically describes being groomed into sexting by adult trans women who she says would accuse her of kink shaming or being transphobic if she said no. There are garbage people in every community. I wish it wasn't the case, but that's not the world we live in. I am very sorry that Benji went through any of this, but the takeaway here shouldn't be that trans women are sexual predators or that transgender non-binary AFAB youth aren't actually that. Transgender non-binary youth are a vulnerable population. Things like Shrier's book only exacerbates that. Benji joined the Gay Straight Alliance in high school and socially transitioned at school in 9th or 10th grade. And at some point, she was elected president of the GSA, given a rainbow flag cape, and dubbed Captain Dialogue. It seems implied that this wouldn't have happened if Benji was a cis lesbian, which probably not true.
Her secret life as a boy, the life her parents didn't know about, was the one that seemed to be going well. Her grades began to fall apart and her depression increased, but at least her GSA and online trans community seemed to appreciate her.
Her home life was not good. That is known to have an impact on school performance. Same goes for depression. Shrier has argued that these youths identifying as trans and or non-binary will lead to that dip in school performance, but it really seems like other factors in these kids' lives are what's driving the effect.
That year, in response to a domestic dispute, the police were called to her home. A social worker in Toronto began checking in on Benji and her sister and arranged for them to see a therapist. Benji told the therapist her secret. So the moment that I said I was trans, there was no question whatsoever. And it was like, yes, you're definitely trans, because I think that's probably their policy, but I also think she was biased.
It's not surprising given the rest of the book, but I'm still a bit shocked that the therapist affirming Benji in that situation is being treated like it's a bad thing. A fight between her parents resulted in the police being called and a social worker being assigned for the kids. I feel like there's a lot of important details in Benji's story that are being glossed over or omitted to focus on Shrier's point. Benji started chest binding and presenting more masculine. She would take the subway to see her therapist and was prescribed antidepressants, but her grades kept dropping. Her and a friend would also hang out at LGBTQ youth groups in Toronto or host gay movie nights at her house when her parents weren't home. One of Shrier's arguments earlier for how sheltered and immature the youths of today are was that they aren't independent enough. But Benji going solo on mass transit at 15 and doing after-school activities is framed somewhat negatively here. I got my license at 15 and was driving myself to school and other activities. It's not like that's a crazy young age to be given these sorts of freedoms.
The gender ideology world she inhabited was a cult, she insists, because when you're inside, you believe non-reality and you disbelieve reality. It literally got to a point where if I was in a queer space, she said, I would look at someone and I couldn't tell if they were male or female until they told me because I had trained myself to think that way. I would look at somebody and be like, I don't even know what their sex or gender is because I haven't asked them their pronouns yet. I was so brainwashed.
Like we don't have to learn what the cultural signifiers for man and woman are in a cisgender normative society? As an elder millennial who's trying to do my best in respecting people's genders, it would be so super helpful to get to a point where I wasn't fighting years of experience in assuming a person's gender based on what I see. I'm not finishing it. Fuck. Coupled with being a socially awkward penguin, I am super worried about misgendering somebody because doing stuff is basically a habit that is really hard to break at this point. But sure, Shrier, by way of Benji, not assuming a person's gender in a queer-friendly space, that's a bad thing.
Her parents were very disappointed in her grades and upset that she seemed so insistent on presenting in a mannish way. At some point, her mother tossed a razor at her in the shower and said, "Shave your fucking legs." Benji now believes the stress and academic pressure she felt at home was a key instigator of her escape into a trans identity.
Benji's home life was fucked. No question. I imagine that shower interaction was just a tiny piece in a larger toxic puzzle. But from the way everything's talked about, it seems like Benji is kind of scapegoating identifying as trans for a lot of the general hardships she was experiencing.
When she complained online about her parents, queer adults often coached her on running away from her family. At the time, she believed that these adults, not her parents, had her best interests in mind, and that they were generally helping her to escape mentally and physically from a tumultuous home. But she no longer sees it that way. They were weaponizing it against me to kind of draw me into their community more, and draw me away from anyone who would give me rational ways of thinking about my life.
Benji, from what's been shared here, your parents didn't have your best interests in mind. Not by a long shot. And I imagine the unfiltered story, the details get much worse. I cannot exclude the possibility that these online people were telling Benji to just cut and run. We don't know what was said. But in the interactions I've seen for youths in similar situations, there's been a focus on the person's safety, first and foremost. Part of that safety is in securing the ability to live independently from the parents, which tends to be a financial issue. If they're in immediate danger, the advice may be more about getting them safe, and that may involve a youth shelter in the area or if social services can do anything. But would it be better to advise someone in Benji's situation to try and really listen to what feedback her parents are providing and sincerely make the changes they're asking for? The same parents who potentially physically abused Benji? What fucking world is Shrier living in? Benji thinks she was brainwashed by the trans ideology, but I'll be damned if she hasn't fully embraced the gender-critical one. Benji's well-being continued to deteriorate, and she describes how her parents had to physically force her to shower and go to school. And all of this is attributed to her trans identity making her life worse. She wanted hormonal treatment, but, quote, was frightened of what would happen to her if she did this while she was still living at home with her parents. And so she asked her therapist for alternate coping strategies because she couldn't transition at that point. And Benji said that this confused the therapist, who only knew how to put people on hormones. If true, sounds like a shitty therapist. But this whole situation's just bad. She felt like hormones and surgery were the way for her to be happy, and thinks that's the case for a lot of other trans people too. So when they do start hormones, a lot get euphoric and develop an addiction. I'm not saying it's not possible for somebody to become psychologically addicted to hormones, but to say this occurs for a lot of trans people? Of course, Shrier is conveying this through Benji, whose experiences are more valid than data. Another person who detransitioned, Erin, also told Shrier testosterone was addictive. In a confusing detail, she started testosterone in her 20s when she said she was no longer experiencing gender dysphoria. She rolled with it to be accepted by the community. She hated it and how it made her feel, but her trans friends just told her to up the dose. Because she hated it but was obsessed with doing it, that therefore means it's an addiction. If you are pursuing some sort of hormonal therapy in this context and it's not feeling right or good, talk to your doctor, but maybe it's not the best treatment option for you. And because these things still need to be said, a person does not need to go through hormonal therapy, surgery, like anything in order for their identity as a trans and or non-binary person to be valid. If they're cool with where their body is, great.
In the transgender social scenes both NG and Erin frequented, testosterone was the coin of the realm, and top surgery a coat of arms. Older trans people at the LGBTQ Center in Toronto, Benji said, would offer their testosterone to teens to try, and provide advice about which doctors were trans-friendly, or trans themselves, and willing to see the kids after hours. One adult visited the center to coach the adolescents on convincing therapists to sign off on their top surgery. So they basically concocted a bunch of stories as to why they needed top surgery. And it was like, any lie is okay if it leads to surgery because you need surgery. That was like the mentality we had. The same thing with hormones.
I'm wondering if this coin of the realm business is more that it's a common experience, and given the history of medical gatekeeping, something that's talked about a bit. It is entirely possible that these adults were blindly advising surgeries and hormones for everyone, but it's also possible that that's what Benji got out of it. The person could have included more responsible framing, like you really need to consider if this is right for you, but that didn't stick for Benji. With regards to sharing medication, especially with youths, if it happened, it was so irresponsible for the person to do that. Now, I understand this is a very complicated issue with a long history for why this may have happened. Getting prescriptions for hormonal treatment to this day is a very difficult process and requires a lot of medical hoop jumping, and if you don't answer the questions just right, you're going to be denied the treatment that you want. That's why this sort of coaching happens in the first place, because of all the gates being put in the way to try to make access difficult. Divorced from that context, it can sound like a person walking in with a trench coat. Hey kid, want some tea? First try is free, but let me tell you what you need to do to get more. But a question I keep having this chapter is, what is the purported end goal here? Why would anybody manipulate or force somebody into being trans if they're not? Benji wanted to pursue medical transition treatments when she left home, but was worried about testosterone potentially making a chronic pain condition worse. She was also concerned about the changes she saw happen in her friends.
Tea makes people really irritable and often very depressed, and it makes you gain weight. And a lot of people already had eating disorders before. And it makes your appetite uncontrollable, and it makes you sweat and smell like a man, which is kind of disgusting if you weren't expecting it.
Shrier technically has a source for all of these side effects of testosterone. Granted, it's not a medical professional, but she has a source. Good thing I added the "oh really" owl. Benji followed a gay guy on unspecified social media platform, as he had in his bio that he was, quote, homosexual, not homogenderal, and she was curious about his views. One of Benji's friends screen capped the mutual followings and posted it online to try and get their mutual friends to cancel her. This made her mad, and she wanted to know why he did that. He said talking to these people would make her suicidal, stop being trans, and cause her to, quote, literally die. This absolutely happens, and it absolutely needs to stop. The most compelling explanation I've heard for this is that the trans and or non-binary community is one who's faced a lot of bad shit, online and off. Experiencing abuse isn't uncommon. To quote from one of the stories shared with me for the ending of the series, this space has a community full of vulnerable and hurt people. Many of them are desperate. Many of them are hurting and in need of help. Violence happens to us frequently. It isn't even 2 weeks that go by without me hearing or seeing someone in our community getting hurt or killed. On top of that, transphobes infiltrating the space for nefarious purposes isn't uncommon. So the hypervigilance in sussing out bad members is an attempt to keep the person and the group safe. But it has the consequence of a lot of false positives, especially when it's difficult to not read things without assuming negative intent given past experience.
Online shaming, Benji says, is pervasive in the gender ideology world, and a key mechanism for controlling the behavior of the suddenly trans-identified. If your friends catch you failing to use the correct terminology, they will attempt to re-educate you. They believe they're helping. They don't want you to be called out. They don't want to have to cancel you too.
First, there's the culty veneer painted onto all of this. Behavior control, re-education, really? We're bordering on Peterson's compelled language thing here. Second, is correcting someone's incorrect pronoun use because they messed up or they just didn't know shaming? I had the misfortune of using Abigail Thorne's former name instead of just calling everything Philosophy Tube for the first time in a video the day before her video where she announced she was trans went live. I say misfortune because a lot of comments on that video were letting me know that Abigail Thorne goes by Abigail now in case I didn't know. But I did know. I probably found out at the same time as the people who were telling me this, which was the same time for everybody when the video went live on YouTube, which was the day after my video was uploaded, which was 2 weeks after the scripting started on it, so. But all of those comments weren't a shaming. It was demonstrating that they weren't reading other comments where people were telling me the exact same thing, but thanks for the engagement. This wasn't a shaming. These sorts of small corrections are generally done so that somebody who cares to use a person's name and pronouns isn't potentially making a mistake in the future. There are far better examples of online shaming Shrier could have used. Finally, I think the shaming here comes into play if somebody's willingly dead-naming or misgendering somebody. But even then, the canceling doesn't do much. Getting caught in the crossfire here super sucks for members of the community, but for people like Rowling or Chappelle, it's just PR on a Tuesday. Benji finished high school, moved in with her grandmother, slung coffee, and started uni. And at that point, she realized she was attracted to women and was considering top surgery. At some point, a guy friend who was having a rough go in chemo had a conversation with her.
He was like, I'm literally going to die if I don't have this medical procedure. And he was like, why would you put yourself in the position to be like under the knife and under anesthesia and with like all these possible complications when you're not literally going to die from having breasts? It was a turning point for Benji. She knew her friend had suffered by a dysmorphic disorder for years. He could empathize with her gender dysphoria. She didn't have a satisfying response to his question. What was she doing?
The more I hear about Benji's story, the more it sounds like a transgender identity would be a bad fit for her. And yeah, if she doesn't have satisfying answers to those questions, top surgery probably isn't a good idea. For her. In the stories I've received so far, these surgeries and treatments are called life-saving, because without these, the people wouldn't still be here. And holy shit, that conversation. I understand being put through the medical ringer potentially making you want to urge your friends to not do relatively elective surgeries, but hopefully this was in response to Benji expressing doubt or something. Experiencing body dysmorphia does not make you an expert on whether someone else should pursue gender dysphoria treatments.
She was afraid to leave the trans community cold turkey. She didn't think she could afford to lose its support without replacing it. So she found another online community. Gender-critical radical feminists and lesbians like herself. Once she began to accept herself as a lesbian, she realized that she was no less a woman for being attracted to women or for failing femininity tests.
It kind of feels like this entire book was built to lead up to this moment. Like, this is the piece that Shrier started with, and she worked her way backwards on how to get here. The first sentence makes Benji sound a bit codependent. Like, I understand it being scary to leave a space where you have a lot of positive support, especially in the situation she was in, but feeling like you needed to replace it with something else? That's not healthy. And Benji could have potentially found this sort of support in non-gender critical feminist spaces. This sort of acceptance is not exclusive to TERFs. If anything, other feminist spaces can be a bit more accepting, as you don't have to have the right chromosomes to belong. But Shrier is not done singing the gender critical praises.
She soon learned that a lot of young lesbians are uncomfortable with their female parts as they wrestle against internalized homophobia and come to terms with their emergent sexuality. Gender dysphoria, she decided, did not necessarily make her trans.
I am not lesbian, so I can't speak to all of this, but as a woman, there is a lot of cultural bullshit to unpack sexually. The Madonna-whore dichotomy, the cultural push to be attractive in certain conventional ways, but any effort that you put into being attractive could potentially be used against you at some point. Your expected life trajectory, and so on. But Shrier is apparently taking a page from the Lobster Daddy handbook and redefining words now. Gender dysphoria has a very specific meaning which does not include general discomfort with one's reproductive bits in this manner. Benji could absolutely be experiencing discomfort with her lady bits and all of that, but that isn't gender dysphoria. Calling that is only blatantly serving Shrier's argument that these AFAB youths aren't really trans and are non-binary. Although it somehow also allows for them to experience gender dysphoria, which is almost a step forward. This also seems to imply that these AFAB youths would identify as transgender or non-binary in order to not be a lesbian. As touched on much earlier in the series, a person's gender identity isn't inextricably linked to their orientation. A person can be straight and trans, gay and trans, ace and trans. The full range of possibilities is open. At 19, Benji, quote, unfriended all the gender extremists and said she was a woman.
She knew a lot of gender extremists would dismiss her desistance, claiming it proved she was never really trans. This is a circular logic that pervades trans ideology. If you desist, you were never trans to begin with. Thus, no real transgender people ever desist. It's an unfalsifiable position.
This is such a weird, sloppy argument. We're apparently meant to forget that Shrier dismissed the possibility of gender being fluid in the therapist chapter, because it seems like Shrier's saying that Benji was trans, but then stopped. But Shrier accepting Benji's gender identity is somewhat fluid while, during, with Benji's claim she was indoctrinated goes against this book. Because Benji was an AFAB youth who identified as trans after finding info online, which up until now has not been acceptable. What? Online sources are only okay if it's gender critical. I cannot deny the probable existence of people who would say that Benji was never really trans. They almost certainly exist. But to tap on the statistics glass again, there are a whole list of reasons why someone would detransition. Realizing gender transition was not for them accounts for 5% of the people who detransitioned. If anything, it seems more likely that an implicit assumption would be made for Benji based on the odds. That she has detransitioned because of external pressures, not because she wasn't really trans. Speaking of strange arguments,
I would like to ask those people under what conditions do they think a lesbian can go to a gender therapist and be told, no, you're not trans, you're a lesbian. Because I have never heard of any situation where that happens, ever. How is it possible for any medical condition that every single person who walks in the door definitely has it?
I would think the conditions for a person going to a gender therapist and being told they're trans is if they say they're trans. But quick internet search later and we can see that that's not the case. From the linked website in the description, a gender therapist shouldn't attempt to diagnose you because of your identity or try to change your mind. They shouldn't limit or presume treatment options or goals based on the labels or language used to describe yourself. A gender therapist should never presume your gender, force you into a gender, or attempt to convince you that you're not a particular gender. So to answer Benji's question, under no conditions should a gender therapist tell a lesbian what gender they are. And, again, gender and orientation are separate dimensions, and Shrier by way of Benji is once again conflating gender dysphoria with identifying as trans. Being trans and or non-binary is not a medical condition. The gender dysphoria that can accompany those is. Benji dropped out of college and moved back in with her parents. Cut to the present, and her parents have separated. She's living with her dad and studying music. She thinks that these AFAB youths are being fast-tracked into medical treatment by a system that doesn't want to acknowledge varying degrees of severity for gender dysphoria. And specifically, she thinks that transition should only be for severe cases of gender dysphoria. Anything short of that, and you only get therapy. I guess we're also supposed to forget that Shrier previously argued against social transition as part of the process. Beyond Shrier's argument, there's the pesky little feature of informed consent treatment in this space potentially rising to the request of the person asking it. I say potential because of the gatekeeping still very much present in this process for most people. Somebody might not have severe gender dysphoria, but still want some sort of hormonal or surgical treatment, and in order to receive the go-ahead for that treatment, they need to present themselves as severe to the medical staff. Other things like huge wait lists for treatment are also a common complaint. Basically, it's like some people can apparently get access to the fast track for treatment and green lights and rubber stamps everywhere, but they are the magical exception, not the rule.
This type of thinking has made Benji an outcast among many of the people she once considered her real friends. She's been put on 125 Twitter block lists, so that those who subscribe can't see her profile. Basically, I'm blocked by all these people so that they never have to interact with me, she says.
Wait a minute. I thought Benji went through and unfriended everybody from that space. Were they really her true friends if she went and unfriended them first? It's also hard to verify if she is indeed on 125 block lists because her Twitter account is now suspended, but more on that in a sec. And given the nature of the tweets that she's included in one of Shrier's references, it's not really that hard to understand why transgender non-binary people wouldn't want to interact with her further.
Twitter and Medium happily lend their help. Benji's been kicked off of both for her allegedly hateful conduct. She believes her specific crime was misgendering. She referred in a tweet to a MAB trans activist, Katie Montgomery, as a man.
That is one super densely packed box, but let's get to it. And note 1 is to a Fourth Wave Now post by Benji about being kicked off Twitter and Medium. The short version, from surviving tweets and screenshots, starts with a post from a Parents of Trans Kids Facebook group being leaked on Fourth Wave Now's Twitter. Then the gender-critical arguments were fought against by people supportive of trans youths, and Katie brought up the views of the Fourth Wave Now website. Fourth Wave Now responded that Katie can't understand the experience captured by Fourth Wave Now because she was assigned male at birth, and she doesn't advocate for people who have detransitioned. Benji got involved when Katie said she does care about those people and wants them to receive better care. Benji responded with the tweet that got her suspended, which puts forward a claim we've seen in this book, that the rise in AFAB youth transitioning in the UK, which is incorrectly labeling everyone who is referred into the gender clinic as undergoing transition, is due to something other than an increase in trans acceptance. Then questioning how Katie could know why an AFAB person would want to transition because she isn't one, said in less nice terms. Then, in a little bit of irony, in her Fourth Wave Now post, Benji suggests people steer clear of Katie on Twitter. The rest of this is talking about the appeal process, going through the Better Business Bureau to try and get the suspension lifted, but this being denied because she'd been suspended too many times before and was violating rules regarding targeted abuse. Oh, her Medium account was also suspended, so this is all very 1984 or something. Looking at Twitter's expanded description for what constitutes hateful conduct, there are a couple sections that seem relevant, but of particular note is a section on repeated and/or non-consensual slurs, epithets, racist and sexist tropes, or other content that degrades someone. This specifically includes, quote, misgendering or dead naming of transgender individuals, which it seemed like Benji did at least on the semi-regular. So yeah, Shrier, you're sort of right here. She violated Twitter's rules on misgendering people. Shrier claims it's hard to find the number of people who have detransitioned, but that, quote, trans activists commonly deny there are any. Reference 3 is a piece in the Intelligencer that's basically a condensed version of this book. Guess who's done with this shit? Shrier points to a tweet from Blanchard about the DSM not having any sort of remission allowance for gender dysphoria, which makes it hard to clinically track.
But detransitioners exist. Once you've met a few, you realize how far one can travel down the path to medical transition before turning back. It turns out Benji got off easy.
Let's close out this video by reiterating something I've said in the series before, and something I think that echoes a lot of transgender non-binary people's sentiment. People who want to transition in some form should be able to, and people who don't want to shouldn't. I think the solution to people transitioning and then detransitioning doesn't involve blocking off access to transition for everyone. that doesn't do the least amount of harm. To me, it seems like we need to increase awareness and understanding of what it means to be trans and or non-binary, not remove sources of information from this from places like schools. If people can have a better understanding of what's going on in themselves and acceptance for what's going on in other people, that can only lead to a drop in the number of people mistakenly pursuing transition. But that's enough for this video. Till next time.